Thank you so much. I wish I could be there. Hi, everyone. Also, our family is just recovering from COVID, so excuse the extra coughing in my talk. But it's nice to see you all. Wish I could have been there in person. I'm going to share my screen now. And we will take it away. So just tell me if you can see the screen. I don't think you can you? Are you able to see the screen?
Screen is clearly visible.
Oh, great, perfect. So I'm going to talk to you today a lot about coupled human environment systems, and it's relevant to the theme of your workshop because they exhibit tipping points. I'll start off by just explaining a little bit more what I mean by a human environment system. Typically, when we scientists study phenomena, we separate out systems, right? We try to understand subsets of systems. It's really hard because everything is a complex system in this world. But typically, we're trained in certain disciplines and we separate things out to study them in isolation, basically, because it's easier. And that's just how science has developed. So for the most of my career, I spent my time in this top circle studying environmental dynamics. I'm an ecologist. And so this can be everything from, simple logistic models of growth to very complex multi-species community dynamics, biogeophysical processes, etc. And this is the realm of ecology and environmental science. And we have, pretty good understanding on many systems in this realm. But of course, there's still a lot to learn. But for most of my career, I've spent time, and maybe some of you, I'm not sure who, the disciplines of the audience here. I imagine it's multidisciplinary. Spend your time studying these things. Of course, we know that environmental systems are affected by human dynamics. Hardly any system on this globe is not affected by human dynamics anymore, if you consider such processes as climate change. However, the field of study of human dynamics still remains fairly independent of studying environmental dynamics, in the sense that, it's in a different discipline. It's usually in a different faculty, different people, social science, humanities, etc. But of course, we know that in order to understand a lot of environmental dynamics, we do have to have some understanding of not just human impacts, like the effects of humans on them, but also what impacts those environmental systems have on humans themselves. How can it affect their behavior? How does social learning and social norms form in human dynamics that then can feed back on environmental dynamics? So in order to truly understand what's called sustainability science, we have to couple these two systems. And they are coupled through processes such as certain things that link these two groups, like the concept of rarity-based conservation. Rarity-based conservation, just a fancy word saying that when things in our environment become rare, humans start to value them more. And they can change. It can be a switch that they can change, and something that is, not so valuable and therefore okay to harvest or extract for our consumption can suddenly become considered very valuable, and it's taboo. It's taboo to harvest them or extract it anymore. And we see this very clearly in the development of, for example, many national environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act in North America, right? It's all based on this idea of rarity, basically many different ways of measuring rarity, but basically the concept of rarity. When something becomes rare, it's protected and it's against the law to harvest it. So you can see very clearly that that kind of dynamic, once you have that going, there's a feedback, right? There's a feedback in harvesting, protection, restoration, mitigation, those types of things that humans do in relation to environmental dynamics, and can really change the pathway of things. And it's a positive feedback. Other types of value, of course, are when humans perceive economic benefits, or when we start to incorporate the idea of, ecosystem services, right? Which is something that's also developing quite a bit. Another thing that can change human dynamics is fear, basically, risk perception. So if we are damaging an environment to the extent that we fear that it's actually harming us, pollution or whatever, then we'll stop, because we want to first and foremost preserve our own health. Of course, these things don't happen so perfectly all the time. Humans are often, many cases in history have occurred where humans have done things at their own peril, right? There's a lot of historic famous examples of Easter Island, and the fall of Rome even is linked to deforestation, etc. So this can happen if we're not very aware of this coupling, right? And it's, of course, eminent for many, many things on the horizon with climate change and the sixth extinction. So this is what we study. And we are very interested in tipping points and alternative stable states in these systems. This is just a brief history for you of, how ecologists and theoretical ecologists have approached studying human environment systems. It starts off way, way back with Malthus, basically. I mean, these are not all fully coupled modeling approaches, but they are attempts to try to understand the relationship between humans and their environment. So it's just a little timeline. You're going to have my slides, so and you can maybe fill in some things that might be missing here. It's just a rough guide. But basically, models over time increase in complexity, and we come in way at the end of this timeline here with our approach of coupling these models. And there's still, when we entered into the field in this area, I mean, when I say we, I mean me and Professor Chris Bao, who you heard from yesterday. We've been working on this together for about 12 years, more than 12 years, well, 12 years now. And both of us were not working in this area before that. I was primarily just an ecologist, a theoretical ecologist, working mostly on like one-way human impacts on ecosystems. And Chris, as you may have heard, or I'm not sure what he exactly talked about, but you probably know that he was primarily a mathematical epidemiologist working on human disease. So what happened was, in around 2012, we had sabbatical at the same time, and we were put in the same office, and we started to talk about how we might collaborate. And there's a lot of work that came out of that over the past 10, 12 years. So it started off with me saying, well, this is what I'm working on right now. This was 10, 12 years ago. And I'm still working in this ecosystem in various different ways. I was working on this endangered forest, this endangered ecosystem of Atlantic rainforest in southern Brazil. This is a particular subtype of the Mata Atlantica that runs all across the eastern coast of Brazil. That's now like basically only less than 10% of this forest is left. It's one of the, it is the, I think still the most endangered forest type in the world. And it occurs, it looks like this, and it occurs in these patches along with natural grassland. A lot like, actually, if you know the area around in the Western Ghats, in the Nilgiris, you have these forest grassland mosaics there, and I have been there, and we're studying that ecosystem as well. Anyway, a lot is known about what maintains these kinds of mosaic systems of forests and grasslands. I don't know if this image is familiar to anybody, but basically there's tipping points, right? There's tipping points, there's alternate stable states in the system. It's one of the classic examples of alternate stable states in ecology. And you can have, you know, there's two dimensions here: fire frequency and precipitation. And basically this precipitation axis will explains mostly whether you see forest, savanna, or grassland. But that these three ecosystem states can also be determined by fire frequency. And, you know, there's regions in between that are unstable. So it's a classic tipping point type of system. So that dynamics is really well understood. We're still very much on the environmental side of things. And there's models, many types of models that, you know, and people have applied very in a straightforward manner, the theory of alternative stable states and non-linear dynamics to study these systems. If you want to, you know, when will the forest, you know, become savanna? When will the savanna become forest, et cetera, et cetera. So we took a very simplistic modeling approach to this system. So this is where it all began. And I'm just going to, this is an old paper, but it's really where everything started. And if you go back to this first paper, it will, and the reference for it is, there, Ines Bao Anand, down here at the bottom of this slide, 2013. It was published in 2013. We started the work in 2011. But I'm just going to very quickly go through it because all of the elements of everything that we do later can pretty much be traced back to this paper, where we took a very simple model on the environmental side, which is a, you know, one equation model of forest transition from forest to grassland. In our system, there's no savanna in this part of the world. It's either forest or grassland. And so that's the equation, very, very simple. But everything sort of hinges on the functional form of this recruitment function, which is of course related to fire frequency. And that's the recruitment function. And this is what it looks like. So you can see there's a threshold behavior here. And this itself is a sufficient condition to explain and generate and predict the existence of alternate stable states in this system. But of course, as I was saying earlier, we're not only interested in, you know, how much forest, how much grassland, and what causes the difference between them from a natural dynamics point of view, which can happen just on its own without any human intervention, right? That can happen with a change in the frequency of fire, with climate change, etc. But of course, humans also affect these systems. Humans do change the frequency of fire. They have historically in this ecosystem. So they can actually cause these changes, and other things that humans do in these systems can also alter the states. So we were interested in studying that. But of course, when we went to look for models of human behavior in the system, there were none. And even more broadly speaking, there were very few models of human behavior coupled to ecological dynamics, like truly coupled. So we started from first principles, and frankly, a lot of these first principles still exist in many of our models. So that's why I'm starting at the beginning. And in this particular system, we knew that just from talking to our collaborators over there, this is my collaborator, Dr. Valerio de Pata, that there's really some interesting dynamics, human dynamics, that can affect these transitions, these tipping points. So the most interesting thing is the third one, but basically we have very simple models of human behavior, assumptions of human behavior. Humans can be grouped according to their behavior. Very simple assumption. Humans value ecosystems or species more when they become rare. We've already talked about that. And generally we find that to be true. And then, but in this case, there was a third thing. And this is the idea that humans can influence others in their values or opinions. And in this particular ecosystem, this took the form of the fact that in this area, it's very interesting because depending on who you talk to, some people really, really prefer the forest state, and some people really, really prefer the grassland state. And maybe you can already imagine who these people might be and why they might have these preferences. But there's a whole host of reasons. It's very complex. Some quite rational, some we don't know. It's not the people who don't realize, they say, I just like this better. I don't know why. But some is very much linked to use and etc. But this idea that humans can have these preferences, right, is very broad. It can be applied more broadly to any kind of alternative stable state tipping point system where, sometimes it's very clear what's good and what's bad. But most of the time, not most of the time, but a lot of the time, it's not clear what is best and for who it's best, right? So it's very, very interesting. So what we did was we took those three ideas of human behavior, and we made the simplest possible model of human behavior in an equation. And this is what it looks like. Maybe you've seen this by now. So X is the percentage, in this case, of humans who prefer forest to grassland. 1 minus X is the percentage of humans who prefer grassland to forest. And then there's a couple of things in this equation. One is this term S, which is the rate at which preference shifts due to imitation or people talking to one another or influencing one another in their thoughts. We introduced that as a parameter. And then, of course, there's this big function over here, which is a conservation value function, which is basically what links the human behavior model to the state of the environment, F, right? So there's a coupling there. And I'll show you the functional form of this. And then, obviously then the environment also has to be coupled, doesn't have to, but it is also coupled to human behavior. And that happens through this function over here. So all this first part here is what you saw before, with the environment behaving on its own without any sort of interaction with humans. And then this is the function that links it to humans. And this is primarily a harvesting function because humans, cut down the forest. So the simplest possible human environment model, this is the conservation value function, just to show you that it has this kind of threshold behavior, which then, is basically what leads to alternate stable states in the system. But also the harvesting function also has a threshold type of behavior. And this comes from theory of how humans behave, that there are often these kind of threshold type of responses to things. It's not linear. So just very quickly, the first thing we found when we analyzed the model was, and the thing that we're interested in, and the whole topic of the talk today is, how does this human environment coupling affect tipping points or affect the nature and diversity of alternate stable states in the system. And what we found here is we increased the strength of the coupling between the human system and the environment system in the model by changing one of the parameters. We did many different things, but this is just one example. We changed the strength of the coupling through this K function, a K parameter, which is in the harvesting function. And when we did this, we found that no, not K. K is little k is in the parameter regime here. We changed the what is it? Big K. We changed big K in the harvesting. So big K is increasing as we move across this slide. And very simply put, by the strength of coupling affects, as you can see in the phase planes here, the number of alternative states, the nature of the alternative stable states. You get more, generally with increased complexity, you get more instability and in the system. And there's kind of this midpoint of coupling between the human system and the environmental system at which you kind of get the most stability, or regions at least where you can get the highest region of bistability. So since then, we have, let me just check my time. We have gone on to study this system a little bit further, because probably you're wondering, well, this is still a pretty pure, pristine ecosystem of just grassland and just forest. That's probably like maybe just, the use so far with humans of harvesting is still pretty small in a sense. There's another major thing that humans do to ecosystems, which is way more disruptive globally than harvesting forests, orders of magnitude greater, and that's agriculture, clearing forests for agriculture. So not harvesting for wood, but clearing for agriculture. But of course, in these systems, and as in many places elsewhere, humans will clear natural ecosystems, not just forests to convert it to grassland, but also other natural grassland will be converted to agriculture. And in fact, it's much easier, right, to clear a natural grassland or and convert a natural grassland to agriculture. So in many ways, the human intervention in this area is actually more threatening to the grassland than it is to the forest. And we see this globally because grasslands are extremely threatened globally, and in Brazil and globally. So we changed the model to introduce, so this was the old model with just the two states, possible states of forest and grassland, but we wanted to see if it was possible to have a system, have a coupled human environment system where it might be possible to have forest, grassland, and agriculture coexist. Because as we started to see the land being converted over, it seemed like doom, it was like these areas are doomed, like they will just be 100% covered with agriculture in X many years, because that's clearly the thing that's most valuable to humans, right? So we wanted to study that. What would it take? Basically, what would it take for that not to happen? It was really the question. So we created a model, and I won't show you the details of it because it is all in this 2014 PNAS paper. But hopefully this context will help you read the paper now, or reread it with new eyes. And here are just two examples of analyses from the model, where showing you the types of things we did. We added some aspects of human behavior to this, and in this case, we had parameters that reflected how humans value forests versus how humans value grassland, because remember I told you those were different. And we even went and we gave surveys to the humans, to humans, to people there, to try to quantify that. We sort of said, well, how much would humans have to value forests versus grasslands, or grasslands versus forests, for to find a region where we might have coexistence of some of these states? And it was a very small region here where you could have coexistence of forest, grassland, and agriculture. Most of the time you would either get grassland dominating or forests and grasslands in limit cycles. Another thing we introduced into this was, because we know it's important in conservation and sustainability, is the idea of discounting in time horizons. But I think what was a little different in what we did from how economists might have approached the problem is that we separated out discounting of economic value and environmental value, because we think people think about those things differently. So we had two types of discounting or time horizons. Time horizon just means like the number of years into the future you will value this. Your actions today will be valued in the future. And when we did that, you can see there's a region of this phase plane where, in fact, it's pretty predictable what happens. Like if your time horizon is too high, if your economic time horizon, sorry, maybe the simplest thing is to say that if your environmental time horizon N is too low, then you will just have what I said, what happened. Everything would just shift to agricultural use, because there's no value being placed, no thought being placed to the future value of these grasslands and forests. It's all about the immediate profit, which is usually economic. So, but there is a region in here where you can have coexistence. So it's theoretically possible. It's theoretically possible to have these coexistence of these different mosaics, but it's a very, I don't know, what is the term there? It's an edge, right? It's a fine edge in the system. Okay, since then, we have gone on to study coupled human environment systems, much in the way that I described with the IISc model, but with different types of complexity. And each ecosystem brings some interesting dynamics on its environmental side, and also on the coupling side. So we've applied this with many students and postdocs and collaborators to many human environment systems across the world. And just quickly to, and you'll have this slide, so you have all the papers in one place. We have like many, so this is where we started with IISc, and since then we've gone on to work on problems like climate change, food, invasive species, endangered species, aquatic systems, terrestrial systems, et cetera, just trying this out to study a bunch of different systems. I think most kind of interestingly, and also the COVID, we applied it to vaccines in humans, and we worked on COVID-19, et cetera. So there's a couple of papers in here that are particularly interesting because we started to apply it to climate change, and we use really simple models of climate change on the environment side. Not the big, huge GCM circulation models, but the small, 1 or 2 dimensional climate models that do a pretty good job of actually capturing the essence of those big complex models. So there's a couple of places now where we have applied it to climate systems. Where's Bury? Yeah, so this is it. No, Bury. This one is the first one with our former PhD student who is now postdoc at McGill. This is a coupled human environment system between human behavior and climate change. And, there's tipping points in it. In a sense, there is alternate stable states. So for all of that, this is the secret. This is a secret ingredient that you all can have now and do it yourself. All of these models have in some form this basic type of human dynamic, which has these different components that I've been talking about. They have a social learning rate. You can add or take these out, if they're not important to your ecosystem, of course you can take them out, but social learning rate, you have broadly, a proportion of humans who are doing one thing and then the rest of the people are doing something else, and we broadly call that mitigators and non-mitigators. You have the state of the environment, which this model is coupled to, and then that itself is a dynamical system, right? You have social norms, which are reflected by, majority, that can be either majority enforcing or mitigation enforcing, depending on the state of the value. We have rarity-based conservation, and these two things feed into this very, very complex and all-important utility function. But you can find a lot of data you can make pretty realistic utility functions here. And the main thing, of course, so classically, typically, people will always have a cost, right? Economic cost. That's always the easiest thing to add to these systems, because that's how humans work and think. And you can monetize it, but these other parts of human behavior are still really important. And in fact, when we study these systems, we often find that, like if you only consider cost, it doesn't really explain the behavior all the time, the observed behavior. You have to include a combination of other aspects of human behavior along with the economic to get the most realistic dynamics. We have a review paper that we just wrote that you should probably have a look at. It's with our former master student. So I'll just note that that's worth looking at. And basically what we are finding is that, if you study systems in isolation versus coupling them together, we find that the feedback generally leads to a richer number of possible regimes and tipping points that are absent in the uncoupled model. So you may wonder, is that good or bad? What does that mean for humans, or what does it mean for the environment? I don't know. Generally speaking, because I haven't solved everything, but it's important to know that that's true, right? Or at least that can exist in theory, because if there are more regimes than what we might have imagined by just considering these things in isolation, I think that then presents more opportunities for changes in our systems and our behavior in order to, and more possible, outcomes for the situation. It's not just A or B. And generally speaking, coupling can stabilize the environment as well. Let's see, where am I with time? I think we want to leave some time with questions. I'll just very quickly show you the equations, and like I can't tell what you guys are most interested in, the concept or the equations. So I'll just quickly show you the equations that we used for this paper, Barlow, Cecile Bao, Anand, 2014, because this is when we applied this framework to studying human behavior as it affects forest pest spread, so invasive species in a forest. Like forests always have pests, there's native, non-native, it doesn't matter. They always have pests, and generally speaking, there's a number of things that will determine whether or not that pest becomes actually problematic for the forest, that it cannot survive and it totally dies out. But we all know that forest pest dynamics, predator, prey, whatever, there's all these natural oscillations in many, many ecosystems, and they're used to it and they get over it. And but when humans come into the picture, they can totally change things. And so one of the things that they do is they transport, at least in North America, it's a big, big problem. They transport firewood and will keep introducing these new waves of infestation. And the problem becomes very intractable for the forest because they don't know where, it's spread very large distances. And then it just becomes a human behavior issue. So this is just very quickly, again, how we couple these things. We take a very simple model, the simplest model out there for, forest pest interactions, which is really fairly well understood. There's a huge literature on it. So we take a model like that, but then we introduce into the model, a human. This is L, but you can think of it as X, a human behavior aspect. And then you can see that the form of the human behavior in this model is just like that form I showed you earlier. It has all those same components. We tweak it a little bit depending on how much we know about the human behavior in that particular system. So in this case, we know a lot. We know the cost of transported firewood. We know the cost of local firewood. We know, because that's mostly what determines whether people will bring their own or buy it locally, is the cost. And so on and so forth. So, we couple them like that just to show you how it's applied to another case. So very, very quickly, I'll just sort of summarize a couple of things in terms of what we have found with these models. We find that rarity-based conservation, public pressure in response to environmental degradation can mitigate catastrophic outcomes in these systems. And we've seen some examples of this in the past. And it often can, if we consider this part of human behavior, it can lead to beneficial outcomes for both humans and the environment. But there can be counterintuitive outcomes at very high levels. So we do have to really think carefully about what parameter values are realistic for these models, because there's usually some intermediate level, as I was sort of explaining earlier, in the coupling that is ideal if we want to conserve, certain states. Social norms also, it's important to note, it can be a double-edged sword. So it works if, it works to enforce majority behavior. But if the majority behavior is bad for, is not the one that you wish to enforce, then it's not going to work for you, right? So it can be both beneficial and detrimental to the health of the natural system. And we can see shifts in detrimental towards beneficial norms, of course, happening in society. And, we can try to work with these types of models to study these transitions. But it does provide like a kind of roadmap or theoretical framework to suggest how social tipping points can occur with respect to environmental change. Yeah, just very quickly, social norms. Well, I've already talked about that. You can get, I think I've said this before already, but strong coupling between human and natural systems can lead to, if it's too strong, if the coupling is too strong, if the response is too strong, it can lead to overshooting and collapse dynamics, so instability. So there's kind of this sweet spot in the middle that is good. And we saw an example of this actually in governmental responses to the pandemic. This is just a graph showing government response in orange and COVID-19 dynamics in blue. And, if the response, cases start to surge. So response can be low, low, low. Initially, the response was strong for the first wave, but then it sort of died down. Then cases start to surge, and then you get a response. But there's lags, right? So if the response is really strong, as I said, there can be overshooting and instability in these dynamics. We know that just from dynamical systems theory. I think I will probably stop. Oh, what's happening here? Yeah, will have my slides, but basically these are just some examples from some of our other papers over the years showing how this plays out in different case studies, like historic case studies or contemporary ones. Here we studied the Minamata pollution epidemic with a student who was very interested in it. Here we studied with a couple of students a coral reef model. Again, we used the coral reef model from the literature, but we added human behavior dynamics into it. This is another grassland model. This is the bow paper that I think that was mentioned at the beginning, where we started to apply this also to, this is also a forest harvesting system, but we studied in detail all of the possible tipping points that could happen with introducing human behavior into this model. But something we did in this paper was to introduce the idea of early warning signals, which I think Chris talked mostly about yesterday. And so obviously, it's interesting to know about the tipping points and how many there are and the nature of them. But of course, what I think is very interesting to this group and in general is trying to figure out how to predict them. And so that's another area of research that we are working on. And maybe I'll just say that what we are finding from some of our early work is that when we have coupling between human and environmental systems, the coupling can mute early warning signals. So it can get very complicated. So all the more reason to have a better understanding, fundamental understanding of this coupling. We also find early warning signals are often stronger in social systems than in environmental systems, which is good for us because those are the systems maybe we have more control over. I leave that as a question. And I will stop here and I look forward to the discussion.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Anand, for this very interesting talk. So it's open for questions now.
Hello. Ma'am, I really found it interesting how incorporating the human behavior term can work well across systems. In two of your slides, like in one of the case where I think the 2016 PNAS paper, so the rarity term, that is, it's 1 by F plus C, right? When the forest abundance decreases, human tend to have a more conservationist, it's a reciprocal relationship. And in another instance, probably some of the previous slides that you showed, it was F into some IN. I don't remember the slide number. So, ma'am,
Yeah.
I want to know that how we determine that across systems, this, how do we implement this factor?
Yeah. Okay. The short answer is you have to understand the system that you're studying. The one you're referring to is, I think you're referring to the forest pest model, the FI.
Yes, ma'am.
And
Yes,
I is infestation level in the forest. the infestation level, and that actually is so that term is a risk perception term. Risk perception.
Okay.
So it's not rarity based per se. It's kind of more like the fear factor in the system. Like if there is a lot of infestation around you, forest, or if the environment is very degraded, then it will cause you to have perceive higher risk, and then that will feed back on the human behavior. So I don't know, is that what you're, I can pull up the slides too, but I think that's what you're referring to there is the FI is the infestation level of the forest.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
there's different terms, right? So there's a rarity-based term, which just simply has to do with the cover of the forest, for example, right? Or population size of corals, if it's a coral reef ecosystem, the thing that you're trying to preserve, right? But then there's other aspects too, like the risk perception term, which then has to do with that can be So I think there's these two different things. There's risk perception and rarity-based perceptions or values, just can be slightly different in their formulation.
Okay. Ma'am, another thing, I wanted to know, since you applied this to, we apply this to forests or grasslands, or to obtain a coexistence of both, like you first showed the savanna forest. So since, ma'am, forest fires or these things, they spread across a spatial scale often. So will it make sense if we apply this human environment system in a spatial context? Will it make sense?
It's very important. It's very important. So yeah, mostly what I showed you today don't have spatial components, but we have some of the papers on that list do apply these things in space. In fact, the forest pest example that I showed you was a two-patch model. So it does have a spatial component, and we've extended that to multi-patch as well. And space is very important there because the human behavior is really all about how they travel in space. And we have another paper that we worked on. I know I showed you sort of the simplest examples, but we had a PhD student, Yench, who we started to collaborate with the government, with the Canadian government, the Forest Service, and they had maps and data. They had maps and data on the visitation networks, the networks of visitation to all of our natural parks in Canada. It was this complex, transportation web of the frequency of people visiting different parks. And we use that actually as a basis for a coupled network model, basically, which introduced the spatial component. And as you all know, I'm sure that those networks are complex and structured and very much can affect the dynamics as well.
Okay. Just one more follow-up question, that there's one way that we apply the spatial thing is through diffusivity.
Yeah.
And since humans tend to influence humans, will it be possible to incorporate this human influence through diffusion across space?
Sure, why not? I think, we've been studying a little bit how, the social networks of humans or the communication networks of humans. And the thing is, I'm not sure what would be stronger. Like, I'm not sure if human behavior spreads through diffusion, through or through these types of long distance transport that the forest pests is, right? Nowadays, you all know we're all connected globally through social networks, and we're being influenced by not our neighbors as much as somebody who lives in another country. So it's a very interesting problem, and I think it really does need a lot more study. And we've done some work on it. Some of our more recent papers are kind of looking into that question of, what do different kinds of human communication or human influence networks, how do they affect things? Let me see if I can remember some. I mean, there's one paper, we kind of compared the communication networks of how people share ideas around climate change versus disease versus vaccines. And they're very different looking networks, very different. So it will be system dependent as well. Like certain things might spread more locally and through, classical diffusion, and slowly, like I think, more locally, like many nuclei, but locally. But other types of information and other types of humans, I mean, we're also talking about many different types of humans, right? So it would also depend on how the populations or societies are structured, and culture is really important. That is missing from a lot of these models. And we're just starting to work on it ourselves, but I'm sure there's other people working on cultural differences. So it would depend on many of those factors, I think.
Thank you, ma'am.
Anyone having any other question? So if not, then let us thank Professor Anand for this very interesting talk.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.